It was merely a wedding photograph. A groom and bride positioned together in 1894, their expressions captured permanently. At first sight, it appears as a typical marriage portrait from that era. Composed, tranquil, nothing out of the ordinary. But examine it carefully. Observe her hands. The bride's fingers reveal a narrative no spoken words could convey. Scarring, profound, intentional markings engraved upon her flesh. What occurred to this woman? For what reason is she positioned beside a man who, by every law and tradition of that period, ought never to have wedded her? And for what purpose did someone conceal this image for more than 130 years? This represents more than a simple wedding picture. It constitutes evidence. Documentation of something never meant to be witnessed. Proof of a mystery so perilous it might have cost both individuals their lives. Presently, we at last uncover the reality. If narratives such as this touch you, take a moment to subscribe and select the like button, because what follows will transform your perspective on American history. The wrecking crew was scheduled to arrive Monday morning. By Friday, nothing would remain of the house except debris and memory. 11 years of courtroom battles, delinquent property taxes, and governmental indifference had ultimately decided its destiny. The Victorian residence at Oakwood Road's terminus in Natchez, Mississippi, once representing prosperity and southern magnificence, would vanish permanently. Helen initially encountered the house on a muggy late August afternoon in 2023. She held a senior archivist position with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and she had offered to direct the concluding documentation work prior to destruction. This represented standard procedure, the type she had performed countless times previously. Document the spaces photographically, catalog whatever objects remained, complete the necessary forms, proceed onward. Yet this residence felt somehow distinct. The instant she stepped onto the warped porch, something altered in the atmosphere. The odor of decay and age permeated everything, combining with the distant fragrance of magnolia blossoms. Within, the walls exhibited water-damaged streaks, and the floorboards protested beneath her footsteps. Furniture lay overturned and damaged, abandoned by whoever had most recently inhabited this place, an elderly woman named Dorothy. According to county documentation, she had expired alone in 2012, leaving no offspring, no siblings, no relatives to claim her possessions. Helen progressed through the ground floor systematically, her camera clicking amid the stillness. Sitting room, dining area, kitchen. Nothing noteworthy, merely the typical remnants of an existence concluded and overlooked. It was the upper floor that transformed everything. The ascending staircase was narrow and hazardous, multiple steps entirely absent. Helen ascended cautiously, her illumination penetrating the darkness. The attic felt confined and suffocating, the atmosphere thick with particles that caused her eyes to water. Damaged furnishings, piles of moldering periodicals, a child's rocking horse lacking one leg. And in the distant corner, partially concealed beneath a collapsed shelf, a diminutive leather container. Helen knelt adjacent to it. The leather had split and deteriorated through age, yet the brass fasteners remained functional. She manipulated them open gradually, her digits quivering with an anticipation she couldn't justify. Inside, encased in layers of fragile newspaper from 1932, rested a photograph. She raised it toward the light. A marriage portrait, a Caucasian male in dark attire, an African-American female in a simple pale dress, and a date inscribed at the bottom, 1894. Helen's heart ceased its rhythm. Helen didn't rest that evening. She remained at her workspace in Jackson, the image propped against her computer screen, incapable of looking elsewhere. The countenances gazed back at her. The bridegroom with his jaw determined in quiet rebellion. The bride with her head elevated, her gaze carrying something resembling victory. Yet it was the hands that tormented her. Beneath her magnifying lens, the particulars became impossible to deny. The bride's hands, softly folded at her waist, displayed an arrangement of scars. Thick, corded marks crossing her palms and encircling her wrists. These weren't marks of mishap or sickness. They represented the scars of enslavement, of rope abrasions and manacles, of implements grasped until flesh tore and recovered and tore repeatedly. Helen had examined images of formerly enslaved individuals. She recognized the patterns. However, the Civil War had concluded in 1865, almost 3 decades before this wedding image was created. By 1894, the woman in this picture should have been liberated. She should have existed without restraints, without masters, without the brutal labor that leaves such permanent evidence. So why did she still display recent wounds? The following morning, Helen contacted James, a historian at Howard University specializing in post-Reconstruction Southern history. She transmitted high-resolution reproductions of the image and waited. His response arrived within 2 hours. "Where did you locate this?" She explained the abandoned dwelling, the leather container, the 1932 newspaper wrapping. "Helen," James said deliberately, "I believe I recognize what we're examining. Those scars correspond to something termed debt peonage. Following the war, numerous plantation owners utilized legal strategies to maintain black workers confined to their property. Sharecropping agreements with impossible conditions, manufactured obligations that could never be satisfied, vagrancy statutes that made unemployment criminal. The workers were technically free, yet they couldn't depart. They received beatings if they attempted escape. Some were worked until death." Helen examined the image once more. The bride's hands, the groom positioned beside her. "But she married him," Helen said. "She married the child of her oppressors." "That's precisely what we must comprehend," James replied. "Who was she? Who was he? And how did they end up positioned together in that image?" The quest for solutions had commenced. The investigation started with property documents. Helen dedicated the subsequent 2 weeks immersed in the Natchez courthouse archives, retrieving deed transfers, tax filings, and census records reaching back before the Civil War. The Victorian dwelling on Oakwood Road had been constructed in 1887 by a family that had migrated from Virginia following the war. Before 1865, they had possessed a vast cotton plantation and more than 300 enslaved individuals. Following emancipation, the family sold their Virginia land and relocated south to Mississippi, where they acquired new acreage and reconstructed their wealth through sharecropping. The patriarch, a severe man named Cornelius, managed the enterprise with absolute control. His 3 sons directed the daily labor, gathering debts, enforcing agreements, and guaranteeing that the workers residing on the property could never accumulate enough to depart. In the 1870 census, Helen located a list of laborers living on the land. Among them was a girl named Eliza, age 12, designated as colored, and employed as domestic help. By 1880, Eliza remained present. Now 22, still categorized as a servant, still bound to the identical family that had previously owned her ancestors. Yet in the 1900 census, everything had transformed. Eliza no longer appeared as a servant. She was recorded as the spouse of Thomas, Cornelius's youngest son. They had 2 offspring, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Grace, both classified as mulatto. Helen leaned back, her pulse accelerating. The bride in the image was Eliza. The groom was Thomas. And somehow, against all odds, they had married. They had established a family. They had defied every regulation and tradition that should have destroyed them both. However, the 1900 census was conducted 6 years following the wedding photograph. What had occurred in the interim? How had this union survived in a world constructed to annihilate it? Helen needed to locate the family's private documents. according to county records. The materials had been given to the Natchez Historical Society in 1978 by a distant relative who wanted no connection to the family's heritage. The papers had remained in storage ever since, untouched and unorganized. Helen placed the call that afternoon. The Natchez Historical Society functioned from a converted antebellum residence on Pearl Street. Its rooms were lined with shelves of deteriorating documents and forgotten artifacts. The curator, an elderly gentleman named Walter, guided Helen to a basement storage area where 12 cardboard cartons sat piled against the wall. "Nobody's examined these in 40 years," Walter said. "Best of luck." Helen commenced her work. The containers held a chaotic assortment of personal correspondence, legal records, business receipts, and family photographs. She arranged them chronologically, documenting each page and constructing a timeline of the family's post-war activities. The letters exposed the daily operations of their sharecropping enterprise, crop yields, equipment purchases, grievances about indolent workers. In the third container, she discovered what she sought: a bundle of labor agreements tied with a faded ribbon. The contracts were printed forms with handwritten entries, names, dates, employment terms. Each followed the identical pattern. A worker would sign an agreement to labor on the family's land in exchange for housing, food, and a portion of the harvest. Yet the fine print revealed a different reality. The workers were billed for their implements, their accommodation, their sustenance, even the seeds they planted. Interest accumulated monthly. If they failed to satisfy production targets, penalties were imposed. If they attempted to depart before settling their obligations, they could be apprehended for contract violation and imprisoned. It represented slavery in all but designation. Among the contracts, Helen located Eliza's, dated 1867, when she was merely 9 years old. The document listed her as belonging to the estate, not as an enslaved person since slavery was now illegal, but as a debtor. Her mother had died the previous year, still indebted to the family. Eliza had assumed the obligation. She was bound to the land until it was satisfied. Helen performed the calculation based on the interest rates and penalties specified in the contract. Eliza's debt would have required over a century to repay. She had been born into freedom and condemned to a lifetime of bondage. Thomas differed from his brothers. The correspondence in the archive depicted a clear picture of family dynamics. The two elder sons, William and Robert, were devoted to their father's vision. They managed the laborers with cruelty and efficiency, extracting maximum profit while maintaining workers trapped in cycles of indebtedness. They wrote casually about beatings, about punishments, about workers who had attempted escape and been dragged back in chains. Thomas, however, seldom appeared in business correspondence. When he did, his manner was detached, almost unwilling. He seemed to possess little interest in the family enterprise. Then Helen discovered a letter dated March 1891. It was directed to a legal firm in New Orleans, written in Thomas's handwriting. The subject was debt contracts and the legal mechanisms for releasing workers from their commitments. "I am seeking clarification," Thomas wrote, "on whether a debt holder may unilaterally forgive a debt without the consent of other family members who share ownership of the contract. The situation is delicate and I require absolute discretion." Helen's hands shook as she read. Thomas had been planning something. Over the subsequent months, according to correspondence, Thomas consulted multiple attorneys across Louisiana and Mississippi. He was careful, methodical, always emphasizing the necessity for secrecy. His father and brothers could not discover what he was doing. By late 1892, he had located his answer. Under Mississippi law, a debt holder could cancel a debt if they acquired sole ownership of the contract. Thomas would need to purchase his family's portion. quietly, without creating suspicion. In January 1893, Thomas made his move. He informed his father he wanted to invest in a textile mill in Jackson and required capital. Cornelius, pleased that his youngest son was finally displaying business initiative, agreed to provide Thomas his inheritance early, including his portion of the labor contracts. Among them was Eliza's. On February 14, 1893, Thomas signed a document that Helen found pressed between two unrelated letters. It was a certificate of debt cancellation. Eliza was free. Freedom represented merely the commencement. In 1893, Eliza was 35 years old. She had spent her entire existence on the same land, working the same fields, serving the same family. She had never acquired literacy. She had never journeyed beyond the county boundary. She had never experienced a single day without the burden of debt pressing upon her shoulders. And now, Thomas was presenting her with something impossible. Helen discovered the subsequent fragment of the puzzle in a journal that had been placed beneath the labor contracts. It belonged to Thomas and covered the years 1892 to 1895. The entries were sparse but revealing. March 3, 1893 informed E that her debt is canceled. She did not believe me initially. Showed her the document. She wept for an hour. April 12, 1893 E asked why I did this. I told her the truth, that I have observed her suffering since I was a child, that I am ashamed of what my family has done, that I want to make it right. July 29, 1893, Father inquired why E is no longer working in the fields. Told him she is unwell. He suspects nothing. William and Robert care insufficiently to notice. November 15, 1893 E, and I have conversed daily for months. I did not anticipate this. I did not plan for this. Yet I cannot deny what I experience. The journal entries grew more personal, more intimate. Thomas and Eliza had fallen in love. A love that could not exist in the world they inhabited. If anyone discovered them, Thomas would be disinherited. Eliza could be killed. But Thomas had made his decision. January 8, 1894, I requested E to marry me. She accepted. We both understand what this signifies. We must depart. We must vanish. Yet I would rather exist in exile with her than spend another day in my father's residence. The wedding photograph was dated February 22, 1894. They had married secretly, somewhere beyond the reach of Thomas's family, and then they had disappeared. For years, Helen had assumed that interracial marriages in 1894 Mississippi were simply impossible. The state's anti-miscegenation laws ranked among the nation's most severe, carrying penalties of up to a decade of imprisonment for both participants. Any minister who conducted such a ceremony could be fined and incarcerated. Any witness who failed to report it could be charged as an accomplice. So how had Thomas and Eliza married? The solution emerged from an unexpected origin. While researching the family's history, Helen had contacted descendants of Natchez's black community, hoping to discover oral traditions or family records that might reference Eliza. One of them, a retired educator named Cora, responded with startling information. My grandmother used to relate a story, Cora said, about a woman named Eliza who fled from a plantation near here. She said Eliza was assisted by a white man who loved her. They traveled north to a location where they could marry legally, Illinois. Helen examined the records. In 1894, Illinois was among the few states that did not forbid interracial marriage. The journey from Natchez to Illinois would have required several days by train, passing through territory where Thomas and Eliza would have been in constant peril of discovery. Yet they had succeeded. Helen contacted the Cook County Archives in Chicago and requested a search for marriage records from February 1894. 3 weeks later, she received a digitized copy of a marriage certificate. Thomas and Eliza married on February 22, 1894 in Chicago, Illinois. Witnessed by a minister named Reverend Abraham, who operated a church serving the city's black community. The photograph had been taken that same day. Thomas and Eliza had traveled over 700 miles to discover a location where their love could be made legitimate. They had endangered everything: imprisonment, violence, death, for a single document that declared them husband and wife. Yet the question persisted: what happened subsequently? Thomas and Eliza did not return to Mississippi. The 1900 census that Helen had discovered earlier listed them as residents of Adams County, Mississippi, with 2 children. But how had they come back? And how had they survived? The solution resided in the final pages of Thomas's journal. Following the wedding, the couple had established themselves in Chicago, where Thomas secured work as an accountant and Eliza accepted laundry. They inhabited a modest apartment on the South Side, surrounded by a community of black families and immigrants who posed no inquiries about the pale man with the Southern accent and his dark-skinned wife. For 3 years, they existed in tranquility. Then in 1897, word reached Thomas that his father had died. Cornelius had experienced a stroke and passed away without ever learning the truth about his youngest son. William, the eldest brother, had inherited the estate and the family business. Robert had relocated to Texas. Thomas perceived an opportunity. He corresponded with William, claiming that he had been residing in Chicago for business reasons and wished to return home. He made no reference to Eliza or their marriage. William, who had never been close to Thomas, consented to sell him a small tract of land on the periphery of the old family property, the same Victorian house where Helen would discover the photograph over a century later. Thomas and Eliza returned to Mississippi in 1898. It represented a calculated risk. They lived quietly, avoiding contact with Thomas's remaining family. The local black community accepted Eliza as one of their own. The white community assumed Thomas was a reclusive bachelor with unusual household arrangements. Their children, Samuel and Grace, were raised in careful isolation, educated at home, protected from a world that would never accept them. The photograph remained concealed, secured in the leather trunk that Eliza kept beneath her bed. It was their secret, their evidence, their commitment. The fragile arrangement could not endure forever. In 1904, a local newspaper published an article about miscegenation laws calling for stricter enforcement against racial mixing. The article included a list of suspected violators in the region. Thomas and Eliza were not named, but the threat was evident. That same year, Thomas's brother William made an unexpected visit. Helen discovered a description of the encounter in Thomas's journal. The final entry before the pages went blank: October 17, 1904, and William came today, he knows. Someone informed him about Eliza, about the children. He stood on my porch and called me a disgrace to our family's name. He said I had 48 hours to send Eliza and the children away, or he would report us to the sheriff. Thomas did not comply. Instead, he gathered every document that proved his family's crimes: the labor contracts, the debt records, the evidence of beatings and illegal imprisonment. He composed a letter to a sympathetic newspaper editor in New Orleans, detailing the system of debt peonage that had kept hundreds of black workers enslaved for decades after emancipation. He dispatched the letter on October 19, 1904. The response was immediate. Federal investigators, who had been quietly constructing cases against debt peonage operations across the South, descended on Adams County. William was arrested. The family's remaining properties were confiscated. The workers who had been confined to the land for generations were finally genuinely free. Thomas was never charged. His cooperation with the investigation protected him and his family from prosecution. But the cost was substantial. He was ostracized by white society, his name removed from local histories, his contributions to the investigation buried and forgotten. He did not care. In his final letter to the New Orleans editor, Thomas wrote, "I have spent my existence attempting to repair what my family destroyed. I do not anticipate forgiveness. I only hope that my children will inhabit a world where love is not a crime." Helen completed her research in spring 2024. She had devoted 8 months tracing the lives of Thomas and Eliza, assembling fragments of their narrative from archives, census records, journals, and oral traditions. What materialized was a depiction of remarkable bravery. Two individuals who had defied the most brutal systems of oppression their society could devise, equipped with nothing but affection and resolve. Thomas died in 1923 at age 67. Eliza survived another dozen years, passing away in 1935. They were interred side by side in a small cemetery outside Natchez, their graves unmarked except for 2 simple stones bearing their first names. Their children, Samuel and Grace, matured to lead quiet existences. Samuel became a carpenter. Grace worked as a seamstress. Neither ever married. Neither ever spoke publicly about their parents' story. The photograph remained in the leather trunk, transmitted through generations until it reached Dorothy, Thomas, and Eliza's great-granddaughter, who kept it concealed until her death. Helen understood why. For over a century, the story of Thomas and Eliza had been too dangerous to share. It challenged the comfortable myths that white Southerners told themselves about slavery's conclusion. It exposed the brutal reality of debt peonage. It demonstrated that love could exist across the color line, even when every law and custom conspired to make it impossible. But now, finally, the story could be revealed. Helen published her findings in a historical journal that autumn. The article was selected by national media. Historians and genealogists began searching for other concealed marriages, other buried photographs, other narratives of resistance and love that had been removed from the official record. Cora, the retired educator who had shared her grandmother's story, journeyed to Natchez to visit Thomas and Eliza's graves. She brought flowers and a reproduction of the wedding photograph, which she positioned against the stones. "You deserved better," she said softly, "yet you created your own form of justice." The scars on Eliza's hands had related the narrative of her suffering, but the photograph told a different story. A narrative of survival, of defiance, of a love that refused to be eliminated. And now the world would finally know.